efforts are no longer solely confined to what Moscow considers its own backyard, because Russia considers itself to be an empire, and this vying and deeply inherent desire to rebuild the empire is precisely what Moscow is hoping to achieve. And Georgia will play a role, Moldova, Romania, beyond other parts of Europe, Western Europe, the United States, anyone that can help this goal. I think Russia would be very happy and very comfortable if Donald Trump's United States and Putin's Russia could come to the table in a sort of bipolar environment and divide up the world into two parts. Georgia is just one very, very small part of the bigger puzzle here and the biggest risk.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of On the Edge. Our guest is Tbilisi-born analyst Tinatin Japaridze, who now lives and works in D.C. And the last time we spoke about the topic of Georgia, or as it's known locally, Sakartvelo, and that was back in episode 13 if you want more information and context. Well, since that time, a lot has changed in this small but strategically very important former Soviet republic that lies on the shores of the Black Sea. And the most important thing is that there has been a sham, clearly manipulated election, which ushered into power a lot of Moscow's proxies and their agents. In response, in this tiny country, hundreds of thousands of people have taken to the streets in amazing displays of resistance against their former imperial masters. And to my mind, it's very reminiscent of what we saw here in Ukraine on, among other places, Maidan in 2014. As the situation stands now, both sides seem to be at loggerheads. Moscow's agents in parliament in particular are hoping that they can outlast the protesters who are now on the streets before they get tired and cold and go home. But if they stay on the streets as long as they can to force a second, more legitimate, monitored election, that is what those protesters are nightly going out and making their voices heard about. And all of this is happening under the omnipresent threat of violence. So, Tinatin, thank you so much for joining us here at On the Edge today. It's great to be able to talk about Georgia again. And I want to start talking about Georgia with the recent images that we've seen, especially over New Year's Eve, where there was that enormous table that they set up for a traditional Georgian feast, a supra, which I love going to, and of course eating loads of lovely Georgian food. But it's not just the supra. There's been dancing, traditional Georgian dances that have gone on amongst the entire crowd and also individually. It seems to me like the Georgians, who of course are taking to the streets in massive numbers for such a small country, are also trying to express themselves in their distinct difference from Russian culture and expressing their Georgian culture. Could you talk a little bit about that when it comes to their protest against Moscow's dominion?
Absolutely. And Philip, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you today. And thank you so much, not only for inviting me, but for staying so focused on Georgia amidst everything that is happening in the region at the moment. This is a critical time for our country. And it's critical that the likes of you keep Georgia top of mind and in the headlines as well. So thank you very, very much indeed for your continued support. As for what we're seeing in Tbilisi and far beyond Tbilisi throughout the country at the moment, in many ways, although I am always reluctant to use the word unprecedented, this is unprecedented indeed, because the movement that we are observing at the moment is actually a grassroots movement. I'm sure you've noticed, but your viewers as well may have noted over the past few weeks that actually there is no political leadership at the helm of this movement at the moment. It's very much the people, their will, and their cry for help and attention in the best sense of the word from the broader international community to notice Georgia, to keep it top of mind, and to ensure that what has already happened, not just in Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine from 2014 onwards, but really everywhere else, every part of the globe that Russia has touched, unfortunately, that this does not happen yet again, and that Russia does not get away with it. So in many ways, this is a way for the Georgian people to express themselves, as you well noted, but also for them to use the opportunity for that plea for help, to make sure that we know, you and I, watching what's happening in Tbilisi, we are well aware of what is happening so that the Russian propaganda machine that is unfortunately very close to the Georgian Dream's very own disinformation machine does not get through to the masses and the international community, in turn hushing the protesters and essentially taking us back to 1937 when the repressions were in many ways successful in ensuring that people are so scared and so worried and so fearful that they stay at home and don't come out and make their case in a public manner. So I have great admiration for the young people, their parents, their grandparents that have flooded the streets of the country to make sure that the Georgian Dream and Moscow don't get away with this yet again.
Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of similarities with Maidan in 14. I was here in Kiev for that event, and I see you're right. It all strata. People from the countryside, old, young, all of them taking to the streets and supporting one another. But of course, Maidan turned violent. How afraid are you? Firstly, how much do you see the similarities with Maidan in 14? And secondly, how afraid are you that it will also turn to violence?
I do think that there are some similarities. It's also very unfortunate that sometimes the Georgian Dream tries to use the sort of the phenomenon of Maidan and using this very term to describe what is happening in Georgia for their own gain, which
Yeah.
takes us sort of away from what is really happening at the moment in Georgia. So yes, there are some similarities in terms of how that movement started and the reasons behind it in terms of, in this particular case, also the Georgian leadership essentially coming out and very publicly in a very brazen way halting Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration process and specifically the EU integration process. So yes, there are some similarities, but I would generally try to caution us just because sadly the Georgian Dream and Moscow have used this to sort of not just use but also abused this to try to justify why this movement should be quelled, to avoid bloodshed and spillover of the current crisis into other areas and other parts of the region more broadly. That said, it is also very difficult for us to talk about this as not a Maidan in some ways, just in terms of the public sentiment and the fact that people are standing up contrary to what the regime expected, and they're continuing to stand up for what they believe is right and what is rightfully theirs. And unlike what the Georgian Dream leaders expected that they would somehow have a few protests here and there, get tired, get tapped out, and eventually go home and start getting ready for the many supras at home with their family and friends ahead of the New Year's celebrations. That would sort of keep them off the streets. That is not happening. And it is very, very, very unlikely to happen anytime soon. It'll be very interesting to see how much longer the Georgian Dream leadership will be able to essentially maintain some sort of control over this situation. And to your second question, in terms of what it is that I am most fearful of, I think the biggest risk here is that the Georgian Dream and their security services, the riot police, at some point may be unable to contain the situation and keep the lid on the situation. And once they notice that they're losing control, who are they going to call? And of course, it'll have to be Moscow. And that is the biggest fear, and something that no one is really prepared for. And I don't think that, as much as Russia and the Kremlin are fully tied up and far extended beyond what they're able to do already in Ukraine, let alone other parts of the world like Syria, for example, we know that they are very much at capacity, mildly speaking. But at the same time, it wouldn't take a whole lot for them to quote unquote quell the protesters in terms of the Spetsnaz, the little green men. And we've been there, done that, unfortunately, and we've seen this many times before.
Yeah, I mean, they're not very original in their tactics.
No, they're not.
Once you kind of see their modus operandi, you can see it again and again and again. And they love their proxies.
They do.
So they love to get agitators, which would then give an excuse for either the Georgian Dream authorities, the governmental authorities, or for them to call on Moscow to come in, much like Lukashenko did in Belarus, for example, or indeed there have been instances, of course, out east here in Ukraine. How afraid? I'd like you to explain to my audience lay that out for me, the danger of Moscow's proxies within, say, the Georgian Dream or in other areas of authority or the body politic or culture, what have you. How dangerous is Russia's infiltration in Georgia?
It's extremely dangerous, particularly because they infiltrated Georgia many, I was going to initially say many decades ago, but actually long before then, even under the Russian Empire and then later the Soviet occupation, of course, and they never quite left even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In many ways, they maintained their control and influence. Every now and then, it's either implicit or explicit, depending on what their specific needs are at any given time. But overall, they have very much remained in Georgia, and directly as well, they of course occupy more than, not just 20%, but more than 20% of Georgian sovereign territory at the moment, and not just the breakaways, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, Tskhinvali, I should say rather, but beyond. So this creeping Russian occupation has been a massive problem for years. And of course, after the latest full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when many Russians fled Russia in order to avoid getting mobilized after partial mobilization was announced in September of 2022 by the Kremlin. At that point, many did also go to Georgia, hoping that somehow they would be able to make a home for themselves. And they felt to a degree welcome, though at some point they began to overstay the welcome. And of course, it became less comfortable for them to remain there. But even so, some have stayed. And of course, we cannot overgeneralize, but I am certain that some were there to also try to infiltrate Georgia in terms of disinformation campaigns that they have been spreading, and Russian sort of various campaigns and operations hybrid that they are in the process of still pushing so that they can sort of represent Moscow without Moscow being explicitly present on the ground. So that is very concerning. What we're worried about is a more explicit Russian involvement and a more direct Russian involvement, where the Georgian Dream will no longer be able to tell their constituents and the broader Georgian population that they are not pro-Russian, that Russia is not in any shape or form involved, that all they're doing is they're trying to avoid getting dragged into war, and this entire sort of war narrative of the West wanting to open a second front in Russia's war in Ukraine, that somehow Georgia is one of the goals for the West to sort of drag them into active warfare, which is of course absolutely absurd. We have reason to believe that this narrative has worked very, very well for the Georgian Dream at home.
Yeah, well, they're very good at doing things like that
They
and
are.
setting that narrative and making those kind of threats and the rest of it. I mean, the idea that Ivanishvili has no connection to Moscow is ludicrous. But one of the other things that they do like to do is divide and conquer,
Yes.
and to set groups against one another, and that apparently, from what I'm hearing out of Tbilisi, continues to be a problem. Is that the opposition still isn't unified, that they're very splintered, and I have no doubt in my mind, but that Moscow is facilitating that. Now, the former president who refuses, well, I say former president, she still claims to be president. She hasn't stepped down, and I'm going to probably butcher her name, Salome Zurabishvili.
Zurabishvili, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. I mean, to see her out on the streets during New Year's at the Supra was wonderful to see. But is she somebody that can unify Georgia, or is this clearly Kremlin-backed splintering of opposition going to continue to be a problem?
Well, I do think that for as long as she continues to stay out of politics in a formal way, she will be
Because
able
the president is kind of a figurative. It's not a
symbolic.
lot of power in the
No,
it's
no.
not a lot of power in the presidency.
No, and over time, the Georgian Dream has further watered down the president's role and responsibility, and it's mostly a ceremonial sort of role for Zurabishvili, but also for the incoming de facto president. Actually, he already was sworn in the other day, and
Yes,
what
I
was
saw.
quite a sight. And his role will also be very symbolic. And the goal here is for Ivanishvili and a few key leaders of the Georgian Dream to essentially be able to control and manipulate this very person in this role. So in Zurabishvili's case, I think where they were unable to control her was her ability to be able to maintain her very broad and deep network of contacts in the West, in Western capitals. And that is one of the reasons why the people that we're seeing throughout the country are still standing up and alongside President Zurabishvili as their president, whether or not her mandate has formally expired, because she is representing at the moment the only hope for Georgia's continued integration process, Euro-Atlantic integration, that is. And she has done this very, very successfully. Now, if she were to decide over the next few weeks and months that she wants to form a political party or a coalition, and then suddenly she is one of the opposition leaders, I think that would probably be a mistake on her part, because as much as right now she is able to bring people together, she would not be able to do so afterwards, because then she would just become one of many opposition leaders. And of course, we know that the opposition leaders were unable to come together and consolidate the general public outpouring of this sort of the will of the Georgian people to be able to outvote and oust the Georgian Dream and bring in new powers. Part of the issue here, of course, is that there are very few new names and sort of fresh blood that we could really talk about politically speaking, that we saw on the ballot. And that was quite problematic, and also it made it very easy for the Georgian Dream to be able to further instill this lack of confidence in truly new powers coming in, because they said, look, if your voting is out, you're voting for Saakashvili and UNM yet again. So for them to be able to distance themselves from this narrative and shed a lot of those legacies that continue to burden the opposition, they would need to truly bring in new names. And there are a few people here and there, but so far, unfortunately, there is no single charismatic, strong leader that would be able to bring people together. And I'm not entirely sure, as much as Zurabishvili is extremely helpful in keeping Georgia on its Euro-Atlantic trajectory, that she would necessarily be able to be that political leader to be able to unite the party the way that she's able to do that now by being somewhat apolitical in a way.
Well, and there's also another issue in that, I mean, there are calls for a new election. That
Yes.
the OSCE came out with a report
Right.
recently that indicated that the election which swept in Georgian Dream was deeply flawed, and that's me being polite.
Yes.
Another thing that I think that Russia does, and unfortunately it finds footing in Western audiences and the narrative that they sell that is often swallowed by the West, is that this is a corruption of democracy.
Yes.
That calls for another election because it didn't work out the way they wanted it, or objection to the foreign relationship law or whatever, however it's
Foreign
termed.
agent law, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, the foreign agent law, right. We see it here in Ukraine with the shutting down of the Russian Orthodox Church here, which is just a proxy for Russia. They like to infiltrate these things, manipulate the political landscape, and then sell it to the West as it's actually your guys who claim to be pro-Western that are breaking democracy. Could you talk a little bit about this narrative and why it is that that we've already talked about the infiltration, but when you try to right the road, Moscow uses it as a weapon against you. How concerned are you about that when you're trying to get Westerners on board?
Well, it's very tricky. And one of the things that Russia is very, very good at is noticing where the weak spots are, where the vulnerabilities are, and going right in. And this wedge has unfortunately become very deep. And it's very easy for the Georgian Dream to also tap into some of those vulnerabilities, and to ensure that not only do they want to isolate themselves from the West, but they also want to isolate broadly Georgia from the West in order for them to be able to use this as their playground and not be held accountable by anyone. So the issues with democratic backsliding and the foreign agent law, whatever it may be, that they have a carte blanche to do as they please in order for them to be able to stay in power for as long as possible. And of course, here, Russia is helping them, not out of the goodness of their hearts, even vis-a-vis the Georgian Dream, but because of the fact that, of course, they are doing their work for them. And Russia does not necessarily, in Georgia's case right now, have to get its hands quite as dirty, because Ivanishvili is doing the work for them. So they can just sit back and watch it all unfold and get themselves engaged elsewhere, like Ukraine, where they have to stay hyper-focused on what their various operations are. In Georgia's case, they are waiting for the right moment in time for them to intervene when they notice that the Georgian Dream isn't able to do so on their own. But ultimately, the interests are the same. They have the same interests, and they're able to tap into those vulnerabilities that unfortunately are, of course, there, and we have to be objective.
Well, there's another difference. We can make a lot of comparisons between Ukraine and Georgia, and there is this kind of a family feeling between Ukraine and Georgia. As I'm sure you're aware, really good um, uh, there's good attitude that goes both ways when it comes to Georgia and Ukraine. But Georgia is not Ukraine.
That's right.
Georgia is separated from Europe by the Black Sea. You're out there on the eastern edge. You can't turn to Europe like the Ukrainians can. You're
No.
far more isolated, and strategically important for what is called oftentimes Russia's soft underbelly, where it's kind of bumps up against what was the Persian Empire. You see in Dagestan, Ingushetia, and that kind of thing. So the Caucasus are strategically important. And now that Crimea is compromised and they've had to move their Black Sea fleet, there's a place, the Anakaya deep sea port, which could be increasingly strategically important. There's two questions I want to pose to you in this context. One, you're gonna have to deal with Russia.
Sure.
You're out there on the edge,
That's right.
and you're directly connected to Russia. So unless the Turks are going to suddenly, start moving troops east, they're not really going to help you that much. NATO isn't going to be coming for you. And secondly, how do you get that independence from Russia, and how much are you afraid that they're fixated on you strategically and they're not just going to let it go?
They're not going to let it go. There is absolutely no question about it. They're not going to let it go because also they're looking at the bigger picture, and when they're thinking about their influence, that is Moscow's influence over the South Caucasus, it's been waning over the past few years. So with them losing Armenia, or being in the process of very much losing Armenia, and also the relationship with Azerbaijan is, at best, it's been pragmatic, and it was transactional, and it was about business. And if nothing else, Azerbaijan, if they had to choose between Moscow or Ankara, of course they would choose Turkey. And they're a Turkish proxy. So right now, with the downing of the plane, the Azerbaijan Airlines plane, and the relationship between Aliyev and Putin, mildly speaking, not being what it's been over the past years, that is going to take a major toll on the Russian influence over the South Caucasus. So Georgia right now is the only sort of saving grace for them in terms of them trying to salvage whatever they can with Tbilisi in order to stay relevant in the South Caucasus. It's extremely important to Moscow. And now, of all times, there is no way that they're going to let Tbilisi go easily. They will fight for Tbilisi far more now and more actively than they would have done a few years ago when relations with the other two South Caucasus countries were different. And now they just need to maintain that role that they've had historically, and something that they consider is rightfully theirs. Now, in terms of, when we talk about how Russia views Ukraine versus how Russia views Georgia, I think that's also quite different in terms of Putin's view of Georgia versus Ukraine. He genuinely does not believe that he can claim Georgia as much as he believes that he can claim Ukraine as part of the Russian Empire. I think he understands his limits there, whereas Eastern Ukraine is a very different case for him. Georgia is something else, and he knows that, and he knows his weakness.
And the Russian people know that too.
The Russian people know
the Russian people are very well aware that Georgians are not white, Christian, Slavic.
Exactly.
Yeah, where they see Ukraine and Belarus very much,
absolutely,
much more brotherly. I remember living in Moscow, and the way they treated Georgians was atrocious. So you're 100% right there. I think he does recognize, and the Russians recognize, that Georgia, but it's still strategically important to them.
Exactly. And that is why they're hoping that, because Georgia is a bit more removed from Europe and the West compared to Ukraine, that Europe and NATO are not going to actually go that far to get Georgia out of this situation, because Putin believes, and I think the Russian government broadly sees this as, well, it's just not going to be worth it for them. So how far are they willing to go? Not that far. And that is why they want to ensure that Georgia does not become part of the European Union and NATO for as long as it can possibly put this off, because geographically and strategically, it'll be a little bit more difficult, unfortunately, for Georgia, for the West to get involved hands-on as they did in Russia's
Ukraine.
war in Ukraine. So that is going to keep Georgia a little bit more attainable in their minds, in Moscow's mind, for them to sort of do whatever they want and have a quasi carte blanche, as long as they don't militarily intervene in Georgia. I think hybrid operations are going to be where Russia capitalizes on its involvement in Georgian domestic and foreign policy relations and the situation broadly, because they don't have to do a whole lot more for the time being. And this is quite comfortable for them. In terms of an intervention, we're unlikely, I think, to see something that resembles the April 9th, 1989 massacre in Tbilisi, for example. Because there's just not because they're going to shield Georgia from the bloodshed, not at all, but because the Russians are not going to feel the need to do so and to overextend themselves. And they're hoping that... Yes.
I hate to interrupt you there, but let me follow. What about a repeat of 2008? Can we anticipate tanks rolling?
It depends on how much the Georgian Dream is actually losing control over the situation, not just their power, but control of the situation. It's not so much that Russia cares who is going to be in the Georgian parliament in terms of any given political power, as long as they continue to at least to a certain degree represent Russian interests, so that they don't go against Russian interests in the South Caucasus and Georgia specifically. So if the Georgian Dream is able to maintain their control to a certain degree, at least, there is no need for a repeat of 2008. But my fear is that they are losing this power, they're losing this control, and my fear being that because they're losing their power, that the Russians will have to intervene. And if doing so on a Spetsnaz level is not going to be sufficient, then in the worst case scenario, we would see tanks. I'm just hoping that it does not get to that. In the interim, my bigger fear is going to be a civil war, because at the moment, it's not just the Georgian Dream against the Georgian people, but also Georgian people that have gone against each other because of the political divisions that have now permeated and infiltrated families and not just political parties.
Yeah, and I want to follow up on that, but before I do, to talk about that issue that you just brought up, Georgia is a very traditional country overall. Yes, very European leaning. If you go to the history museum in Tbilisi, you see all the kind of Greek Hellenic gold, and this is the land of the Jason and the Argonauts and the Colchis and the Golden Fleece and all that lovely stuff. It is very European leaning, but still very traditional, and especially in the countryside. And one of the weapons that they have used, the Russians, is this narrative of, say, just decadent liberalism, LGBT. You'll have LGBT, parades. Your children will all become trans, yada yada. All the same kind of stuff. But it does have fertile ground because Georgia is, again, a very religious and a very traditional country. Talk to me a little bit about that. Both in terms of the Russians using that as a weapon, and in terms of Georgians' desire to become a traditional Western liberal democracy.
And that's a very, very serious problem, unfortunately, for Georgia, because after all, Georgians and the Russians lived together for so many years that the Russians know exactly who it is that they're dealing with, and the Kremlin knows exactly which buttons to push. It's not as though they came into Georgia as, let's say, for example, one of the African countries where they really had to get to know the population before they started spreading disinformation to understand what sorts of narratives would work and what would not work. In Georgia's case, they didn't have to do a whole lot of experimenting and no testing, really. They just went in knowing full well what was going to work. And one of the pillars of Georgian identity, something that on the one hand we're very proud of, but on the other hand it has become a weakness for us, is our traditional values, which is all wonderful and fantastic until we start talking about the more sort of ultra conservative slivers of the population, where sadly some of these narratives, the anti-LGBTQ narratives and even the foreign agents law, in some ways was successful in terms of the Georgian dream being able to push it through, contrary to what we saw in the streets of Georgia, because they knew that they would be able to tap into the conservative parts of the population and justify why they were doing this, why this was necessary, because the West was going to eventually come in and rob Georgians of their national identity, their religion, the church. And you, Philip, did mention the church. And I think it's very important for us to remember how important the Georgian Orthodox Church is and has been for centuries for Georgian national identity. It is one of the reasons that the Georgian national identity survived the Russian occupation, Soviet occupation, other occupations prior to that, in the centuries prior, because of the role of the church and the Georgian religion, the Orthodox religion, that is so very integral to Georgian identity. But unfortunately, the flip side of this coin is that it has held us back in some ways as well. And it has allowed Russia to ensure that the Georgian Orthodox Church in many ways becomes its proxy as well. We've seen this in Ukraine, and we're seeing this in Georgia as well. And the heavy politicization of the Georgian Orthodox Church is also undeniable. They are very political. The leadership of the GOC has been extremely involved, oftentimes meddling in Georgian domestic politics, which was very important and had a very positive role toward the end of the Soviet era when the Soviet Union was collapsing. And they did play a positive role then, but unfortunately now they are meddling in some of the narratives that the Georgian dream is pushing. And sometimes they use the church to justify a lot of those policies and decisions as a way of ensuring that, this is not ideal, but we're doing this to salvage our identity. And that is very, very problematic. And of course, Moscow knows this very, very well, because they understand that if they want to get through to the Georgian people indirectly without putting a Russian label and a Russian stamp on any of the disinformation campaigns, for example, one of the avenues to do so is through the church, because very few Georgians will stand up and say anything against the church, because it's a sacred part of identity and it's not just about religion.
Have we seen, I have not seen particularly, and perhaps I just missed it, have they been involved in the street protests, the Georgian Orthodox Church, priests or what have you? Have they come out on the streets in support of any of the protests? Have you seen?
A few did. Not the senior most leadership of the Georgian Orthodox.
So not the patriarch. No. Do you have your own patriarchy?
Sorry? We do, yes.
Yes, so you have your own patriarch.
Well, then you were asking
he did. No. The Georgian Orthodox Church, because I've done this before with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, yes, and of course how they have broken away from Moscow's patriarchy.
Right. We're
Does you're separate as well, yeah. So you don't pay homage to, or your patriarch is not connected to Kirill, but is still you're
course,
saying still very much.
yes.
Sorry?
There are channels of communication and they're very much open and quite active. But in terms of the model that we saw in Ukraine, Georgia does not have that challenge per se. So it doesn't have to separate itself from the church formally. But unfortunately, the connections are very much there. And we have some evidence that contact has continued over the past few years between the two churches, and there are visits between the two sides, and that they reciprocate. One reciprocates the other's visits, etc. So that is very problematic because it's very difficult for us to keep the two completely separate. It became a very, very big issue during the outbreak of COVID-19 during the pandemic. There were a lot of issues pertaining to Russian disinformation that was coming out of the church that permeated the Georgian Orthodox Church as well. And that was a major issue. And it was a reminder that actually, even though formally the two churches, they're not necessarily they're not under the same umbrella, at the same time, the connections are very, very much there still.
Yeah, and I'm betting the sentiment is very similar to the very strict orthodoxy that we see in the Russian Orthodox Church. Let's go back to the street protest for a little bit. Certainly, right now, it looks like there is no bottom to the depth of energy and will of the people to continue to come out. I mean, that Supra was amazing. It was absolutely beautiful. And, we see the images of the girl with the European Union flag getting sprayed right in her face with water cannons. We see dancers on the street. How much, this is a very ambiguous kind of question to ask, and I don't know if I can get a direct definitive answer from you on this. I don't think anybody could, but how much longer do you think that they can take to the streets like this?
And that's the key question. I think it's longer than what the Georgian Dream hopes it is, but it's not going to be infinite. And this cannot go on indefinitely. Something's got to give, Philip. At some point, as much as I admire these people who are standing there courageously day in, day out, everybody has their limits. And my fear is that they don't run out of steam, they don't run out of faith, and they don't eventually just accept the reality, something that we saw in Belarus in 2020. That is my personal fear. That said, it's very clear to me that on the other side, the Georgian Dream also cannot go on with the status quo indefinitely either. There is no going back to business as usual. I think they're way past being able to salvage the situation by coming to the table with the other side and coming up with some sort of a solution, even if it's a temporary solution. I think we're past that. And there is no going back. So in terms of how much longer this can go on, this will be a battle where it'll be very critical for us to see who is going to fall first and not get up. We have reason to believe already that because the Georgian people in many ways do feel that the West is standing by their side, sometimes less explicitly than they would like to. But even so, the sanctions are starting to come in, and I think we're going to see much more than what we've seen thus far. And also the masks are off on the other side, and the Georgian Dream has shown its true face. It is not just a pro-Russian party, but it is an anti-Georgian one, which is all the more concerning for many Georgians out there, because some may be able to live with a pro-Russian party. What they cannot live with is a government that is anti-Georgian, a Georgian government that is not there to represent the interests of the Georgian people. It is only there to solely represent its own interests, including financial interests of Ivanishvili and his clan. So
and by proxy, Moscow.
And by proxy,
ultimately.
Moscow. Of course. Ultimately, their interests do meet somewhere halfway. But eventually, something's got to give. I do think that we will see new elections, whether the Georgian Dream wants to or not, before the end of this year. The problem is, of course, it's a very long year. We have 12 months ahead of us. I don't think that it'll be an election that the Georgian Dream wants to agree to, but eventually they may not be able to avoid it. It may become unavoidable at some point. Now, unless we have international independent observers on the ground, the CEC, the Central Election Commission, and all the other entities are independent, we are unlikely to see a very different result. So that is one of the risks that we have here, is if the Georgian Dream was able to do it once, they may be able to do it again in terms of securing, quote unquote, a win for themselves. But if we see a more active Western engagement in the process, and not just words of condemnation and words of criticism, but actual actions and involvement and engagement hands-on, it'll be very difficult for the Georgian Dream to get away with manipulating election results again. So my hope is that eventually these elections can happen. Otherwise, the country is doomed, because that means admitting defeat and essentially rolling over and turning into another Belarus or another Venezuela, which I highly doubt that the Georgian people, as much as they may be tired and cold, and it's only going to get colder and they will only get more tired, I don't think that they will be quitting anytime soon, especially the youth. I think the older generation may have gone back home by now, but these kids they're relentless.
Yeah, it is motivated at its core by the youth, and I am well aware of that. But you did mention earlier your concerns
Yes,
for a civil war. I mean,
yes.
how high are your concerns about that?
I'm concerned about a lot of the divisions that I'm seeing, not just in the streets, but within families, within homes, where
Mm.
families are falling apart, marriages are falling apart. I know so many people in my immediate circle that disagree inherently so much about politics and about which side to support and which side to stand on, that eventually they're unable to even maintain a civilized relationship and hold a civilized conversation. And
And
that,
how much of that is because of the grassroots desire for connections to the West of the Georgian youth in particular, and other elements within Georgia, and how much of that is the manipulation, the misinformation, and the information warfare conducted by Moscow? Is that at the core of this? I mean, you're talking about very intimate relations. These are
yes, absolutely,
family,
absolutely.
in your own house, that are driving families apart. That there must be these two polar, the magnetism of these two different
Yeah.
polar opposites. Could you speak to that a little bit when it comes
Well,
to this division?
I'm afraid that the division is in many ways also the deepening of the division is happening very much thanks to disinformation and other hybrid operations. A lot of the narratives that we are hearing are about, if you don't want the Georgian Dream, it means that you want war. You don't want peace. It's not even about Russia versus the West, because many Georgians, so in this case, Georgia is very different from Belarus. It's very difficult to find many pro-Russian, in terms of pro-Kremlin, not the Russian people, but the Russian government, pro-Kremlin Georgians. There's very few of them that will willingly say to you, of course, there's always going to be exceptions, but overall, very few, including GD constituents, are going to admit to you openly that they want to go back and be with Russia again, that they want to be under Russian occupation. Very few will admit that. They are very much enjoying their ability to travel visa-free to EU countries. They are
Mm-hmm.
very much and have been very much enjoying Western support, including US support over the years, financial support, etc. So in this respect, they position themselves as pro-Western. They like Western movies, and they like being able to travel to New York and to Paris and to London. But when push comes to shove, they say to you, well, I do like the idea of having a good relationship with the West, but the West is not going to come to my rescue when I need them to. Russia will. And also, ultimately, geographically, we are much closer to Russia than we are to the United States, for example. So some will try to justify why they want peace versus war, and therefore they are choosing the Georgian dream as the status quo, because the Georgian dream's propaganda of we are the only reason why you have not been dragged into war has worked, and it has had great traction. So it's very, very unlikely that that could change anytime soon. There will be people who will tell you that they support the Georgian dream, but that they're also pro-Western and they want Georgia to become part of the European Union at some point. And they don't see a paradox in that, even though over the past few months in particular, we have seen how the Georgian dream has done everything and then some to detach itself from the West, to isolate itself, and to depart from the Euro-Atlantic trajectory and orientation as much as they possibly could. But that paradox has not hit some people just yet, I don't think.
As we kind of wind down here, I've basically two more questions for you, and I'll do this one first. Let's pull back to the 10,000 feet level and look at this Georgia as part of a much larger question, as the Russian Empire is kind of fraying at the edges.
Yes.
Obviously here in Ukraine, it's a hot war in terms of fraying and breaking away from Moscow and Putin's Moscow in particular. But you see it in Belgrade, you see it in Moldova, you see it, obviously in Georgia. What does this mean for Putin's vision of the Ruski Mir, of the Russian world, of reestablishing the Russian Empire, when you see this fraying at the edges? Talk to me a little bit bigger picture about what you think in the context of Moscow and Putin's vision of restoring the Russian Empire. Does Georgia play a part, but then also the entire concept of this fraying?
Well, Georgia plays an integral part, of course, and because it's significantly smaller than, for example, Ukraine, it is much easier for Putin and his cronies to do the work that they need to do in order to reach the broader, larger, much larger than Georgia goals that they have. So in this respect, Georgia is, for Moscow, an easier nut to crack to a certain degree. But there are undeniably greater goals that Russia has, that the Kremlin has, beyond just maintaining its influence in the country and in the South Caucasus. In general, I think faith in democracy has been continuously undermined by various prolonged disinformation campaigns and the like for so many years now, not just in Georgia and broader Eurasia, but also beyond this region, right? Disinformation has eroded the public's confidence in democracy everywhere, which is one of the goals that Russia has had for years. But this phenomenon manifests itself depending on the context and the environment. So, for example, through perpetually undermining public confidence in the integrity of democratic elections, which is something that Russia has been able to do everywhere.
Even in the United States, and the foundation of Western democracy, UK, France, Germany. Yeah.
Absolutely. These efforts are no longer solely confined to what Moscow considers its own backyard. And sadly, we know that such efforts will persist, outliving many a leader, including Putin, I'm afraid. It's not just going to be Putin's goal and then that's it, because Russia considers itself to be an empire, and this vying and deeply inherent desire to rebuild the empire is precisely what Moscow is hoping to achieve. And Georgia will play a role, Moldova, Romania, beyond other parts of Europe, Western Europe, the United States, anyone that can help this goal, I think Russia would be very happy and very comfortable if Donald Trump's United States and Putin's Russia could come to the table in a sort of bipolar environment and divide up the world into two parts. And we would sort of find ourselves back in the 20th century once again, where they would say, okay, well, I'll take this part, you'll take that part, and we can live happily ever after until, of course, one or the other decided they're no longer happy with that status quo. So that is my biggest concern, is that it's not just about Georgia. Georgia is just one very, very small part of the bigger puzzle here and the biggest risk.
Yeah, I mean, there is a reason why we put at the end of every one of our episodes a quote from Abraham Lincoln, written, nearly 2 centuries ago now, regarding Russia as a place that undermines the concept of democracy and liberty. And I don't think that has changed. I agree with you. I don't think this is limited to Russia's backyard. I think they're genuinely afraid, and we are at an inflection point. Do we go down the road of autocracies
Yes.
headed by places like Moscow and Beijing, Tehran, for example, Pyongyang, or do we maintain our belief in Western democracy? So that kind of leads me to more or less my final question, unless there's something more you'd like to add. But my final question is really, for a Western audience, particularly obviously an English-speaking audience, particularly perhaps an American audience, although we have hopefully audience members from all around the world that watch. But why should the West care about Georgia? Why should America care about Georgia?
Well, if nothing else, Philip, because we didn't care in the West enough about Georgia in 2008, which is why Ukraine happened, Syria, everything, you name it. It really, in many ways, started with Georgia in terms of the current wave that we are observing and living through at the moment. If Russia is able to get away with it again, whether it's directly or indirectly through its proxy government in Georgia, or by intervening militarily or otherwise more explicitly and more directly, we simply don't know what will happen afterwards. Who's going to be next? By allowing Russia to get away because it considers Georgia and other countries in the region to be part of its backyard, and they have not been able in Moscow to get out of that Russian imperial and Soviet mentality of this is ours and no one should dare intervene because this is our backyard and we will do as we please. We are so past that. And unfortunately, Georgia has been one of the hostage countries since the collapse of the Soviet Union that Russia has not been neither willing nor able to give up. And it's not going to give up on Georgia, and it's not going to give up on Ukraine and just roll over and admit defeat. And this will continue. And if we don't nip this in the bud now, my fear is that the problem will deepen and the Russian reach will expand far beyond its backyard. It's already doing that, but it'll become even more explicit. And we're not just going to be risking democracy and democratic values and everything that we have been building over the past years in Georgia, beyond Georgia, in the United States, but the entire globe, for lack of a better term, is going to be at a huge risk. And Georgia is just one part of, as I said earlier, the bigger puzzle and part of Russia's grand plan. And we cannot afford to give up on Georgia and to give up on the Georgians, because the repercussions and implications down the line will be far greater than this wonderful, vibrant country in the South Caucasus. So my hope is that we are going to keep Georgia as much as possible top of mind, with an understanding of the bigger picture, and that Georgia is at the very core part of this bigger picture that we cannot afford to give up on, because the implications are going to be far graver and far beyond our immediate understanding right now of what could be at risk.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very much a kind of a domino effect.
It is a
Is that
domino.
it'll just keep going, and the Russians will not stop because democracy is anathema to their core beliefs of authoritarianism, and it goes beyond Putin. Aside from that, also having been lucky enough to have been a visitor to your beautiful country of Georgia, of Sakartvelo, from the food to the dance to the music to the architecture to the beautiful hills and mountains of Georgia, it is one of my favorite places in the world, and I truly hope for that reason alone that you're able to push off Moscow's influence, because it is a beautiful, wonderful country that I adore deeply. So, Tinatin Japaridze, I know I will say it incorrectly, but I will try nevertheless. Modolobo, or thank you
Oh,
for
okay.
being with us here,
Thank
and all the best to you and all the best to the people of Georgia. Thank you very much for your time.
thank you so much. Thank you, and all the best to the people of Ukraine.
All right. Thank you.